wagon disappeared into the white curtain of falling snow, and with it went everything 14-year-old Elias Brennan had ever known as home. He sat motionless against the gnarled oak tree, watching the last traces of his family vanish into the storm that had been building for days. The wind howled across the frozen landscape, carrying away even the sound of the horses' hooves and the creaking of wooden wheels. Elias had known this moment was coming. He'd seen it in his mother's eyes for weeks now, that distant, calculating look that appeared whenever she thought he wasn't watching. He'd heard the whispered arguments between his parents late at night, words like burden and impossible and no other choice, floating through the thin walls of their traveling wagon. His younger sister, Mara, had stopped looking at him altogether 3 days ago, as if he had already become a ghost. The injury to his right leg had happened 2 years earlier, when a spooked horse had kicked him during a river crossing. The bone had healed badly, leaving him with a permanent limp and chronic pain that made long journeys excruciating. In a family of traveling merchants who covered hundreds of miles each season, moving from settlement to settlement across the frontier territories, his disability had transformed from a temporary setback into an insurmountable problem. Now, as the temperature dropped and darkness crept across the mountain pass, Elias understood that his family had made their choice. The food supplies were running low. The debts to the trading consortium were mounting, and a 14-year-old boy who could barely walk was a luxury they could no longer afford. They had left him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a thin wool blanket that was already dusted with snow. No food, no fire-starting materials, no weapon for protection. The message was clear. They didn't expect him to survive, and perhaps they didn't want him to. A quick death from exposure was cleaner than slow starvation, and it eliminated any possibility that he might somehow follow them or reveal their route to the debt collectors who had been trailing them for months. Elias pulled the inadequate blanket tighter around his shoulders and tried to think clearly, despite the fear threatening to overwhelm him. He was 14 years old, alone in a wilderness that killed strong, healthy men regularly, with winter's full fury about to descend. The nearest settlement was at least 20 miles away, an impossible distance for someone who could barely walk 100 yards without resting. The wind picked up, driving snow into his face with stinging force. Elias closed his eyes against the assault and felt something inside him shift. Not hope exactly, but a stubborn refusal to simply accept death without a fight. If his family believed he was disposable, he would prove them wrong. If the wilderness wanted to claim him, it would have to work harder than this. He opened his eyes and began to assess his situation with the practical mindset his father had ironically taught him during better times. The oak tree provided some shelter from the wind. The blanket, though thin, was dry for now. He had maybe 3 hours before hypothermia became a serious threat, less if the storm intensified. He needed to find better shelter, find a way to stay warm, find something to eat. But first, he needed to understand what was watching him from the forest's edge. The eyes appeared first, 2 points of amber light gleaming through the swirling snow. Then another pair, and another. Elias counted at least 5 sets of eyes moving through the trees at the forest's edge, circling his position with the patient efficiency of experienced predators. Wolves. His heart hammered against his ribs as the largest animal emerged from the shadows. It was enormous, easily standing 3 feet tall at the shoulder, with a thick coat of mixed gray and silver fur that seemed to shimmer in the failing light. The wolf moved with fluid grace, each step deliberate and measured. As it approached the exposed human who represented an easy meal, Elias pressed himself back against the oak tree's rough bark, knowing there was nowhere to run even if his legs could carry him. The wolf stopped about 30 feet away, its massive head tilting as it studied him with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The animal's ears were forward, alert but not aggressive. Its tail hung loose rather than bristled with hunting instinct. Something was wrong with this picture. The wolf should have attacked by now, or at least called to its pack. Instead, it simply watched, golden eyes unblinking, as if waiting for something. "Go away," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "I'm not worth the effort." The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. It took several steps closer, near enough now that Elias could see the individual guard hairs of its winter coat, could see the steam of its breath in the cold air, could see the old scars marking its muzzle and shoulders, evidence of a life filled with battles and survival. Then the animal did something extraordinary. It sat down in the snow, just beyond arm's reach, and made a sound that was neither growl nor bark, but something closer to a whine. A sound that conveyed not aggression, but something almost like concern. Elias stared in confusion. He'd heard stories about wolves all his life, terrible tales of packs bringing down travelers, of attacks on settlements, of animals that showed no mercy to the weak. Yet this massive predator sat before him like a confused dog, making soft noises that seemed designed to communicate rather than threaten. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice stronger now despite his fear. The wolf stood and began to pace back and forth, its movements agitated. The other sets of eyes had disappeared back into the forest, leaving only this one animal. It would look at Elias, then at the darkening sky, then back at Elias again, as if trying to convey urgent information that the human was too stupid to understand. The temperature was dropping rapidly now. Elias could feel the cold seeping through his clothes, could feel his fingers growing numb despite being tucked inside his coat. He had maybe an hour, perhaps less, before his body temperature dropped to dangerous levels. The thin blanket might as well have been made of paper for all the protection it offered against the mountain winter. The wolf seemed to sense his deteriorating condition. It suddenly moved with purpose, trotting to a massive pine tree about 20 yards away. Using its powerful front paws, the animal began to dig furiously in the snow, excavating a depression against the trunk where the thick branches overhead would provide additional shelter from the falling snow. Elias watched in amazement as the wolf created what amounted to a makeshift den in less than 5 minutes. The animal then looked back at him, at the shelter it had created, then back at him again. The meaning was unmistakable. "Move." "I can't," Elias said, gesturing helplessly at his damaged leg. "I can barely stand, let alone walk that far." The wolf approached him directly, moving with slow, careful steps until its massive head was level with Elias's face. The boy could feel warm breath against his frozen cheeks, could smell the wild scent of pine and snow and something else, something that reminded him of the hunting dogs his father had kept before the family had fallen on hard times. Then the animal did something that defied everything Elias knew about wild predators. It lowered itself to the ground beside him, positioning its strong back parallel to his body, and waited. It was offering itself as a crutch, as living support that could help him reach the shelter. Elias hesitated for only a heartbeat before grasping a handful of thick fur and using the wolf's solid frame to pull himself upright. His injured leg screamed in protest, but he gritted his teeth and focused on the 20 yards between him and survival. The wolf moved slowly, adjusting its pace to match Elias's painful hobble, its muscles tensing to support his weight whenever he stumbled. It took nearly 10 minutes to cover that short distance, but when Elias finally collapsed into the excavated hollow, the difference was immediate. The pine tree's thick canopy blocked most of the falling snow, and the depression the wolf had dug provided a windbreak that made the temperature feel 10 degrees warmer. The wolf settled down beside him, its large body curving around Elias's smaller frame. The animal's thick fur and body heat began to seep into the boy's frozen limbs, driving back the hypothermia that had been creeping through his system. As the storm raged around them and darkness fell completely, Elias found himself pressed against the warm flank of a wild creature that should have killed him. The wolf's steady breathing provided a rhythm that was oddly comforting, and despite his fear and confusion, the boy felt his eyes growing heavy. Just before sleep claimed him, a single thought crystallized in his mind. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. The wolf had known exactly what to do, had understood his limitations, had deliberately chosen to help rather than hunt. But why? What did this animal know that he didn't? Dawn came slowly, the storm finally beginning to ease as gray light filtered through the pine branches overhead. Elias woke to find himself still alive, still warm, still pressed against the wolf that had somehow kept him from freezing to death during the long night. The animal stirred as Elias shifted position, lifting its massive head to scan the surrounding forest. Its ears were in constant motion, swiveling to catch sounds that human ears couldn't detect. Something had changed. The wolf's posture was tense, alert in a way that suggested imminent danger. Then Elias heard it too, the distant sound of voices growing steadily closer. "Trail splits here," someone called out. the words carrying poorly through the thin mountain air. Fresh storm covered most of it, but we know they came through this pass. Keep looking, came another voice, harder and more determined. The Brennan family owes the consortium $1,200 in silver. They don't get to just disappear into the wilderness. Find them! Find the debt! Elias felt his blood turn to ice water. These weren't rescuers searching for a lost boy. These were the debt collectors his family had been fleeing, the hard men from the Northern Trading Consortium who were known for their brutal efficiency in recovering money owed. His presence here would lead them straight to his family's trail. Worse, it would reveal that the Brennans had been desperate enough to abandon their own son in an attempt to throw pursuers off their scent. The collectors would torture him for information if necessary, caring nothing for his age or disability. The wolf seemed to understand his fear. It pressed closer to Elias, its warm body providing comfort even as its golden eyes remained fixed on the approaching voices. There was something deeply protective in the animal's stance, something that suggested it comprehended not just the physical threat these men represented, but the complexity of human malice and betrayal. "Look here," a third voice called out. Much closer now. Something's been digging in the snow. Fresh disturbance under this pine tree. Footsteps crunched through the snow, heading directly toward their shelter. The wolf's muscles tensed beneath its thick fur, and a low rumble started deep in its chest. Not quite a growl, but a warning that transcended language. The animal positioned itself between Elias and the approaching danger, its powerful body coiled and ready to spring. Through the pine branches, Elias could now see the men, 3 of them, dressed in heavy fur coats and carrying rifles. The lead man was tall and lean with a scarred face and the cold eyes of someone who had done terrible things for money. His companions were younger, but equally hard-looking, the kind of men who would follow brutal orders without question. "Just wolf tracks," the scarred man said, disappointment evident in his voice. "Animal probably denned up during the storm. No sign of people." "Wolves don't dig shelters like that," one of the younger men argued, kneeling to examine the excavated hollow more closely. "These prints are massive, bigger than any normal wolf I've seen. And look at this." He pointed to marks in the snow. "Something was dragged here. Something human-sized." The wolf's rumbling grew slightly louder, and Elias could see the intelligence burning in its amber eyes. The animal was making calculations, weighing options with a complexity that seemed impossible for a wild creature. It could attack, could defend its territory as any predator would, or it could retreat, leading the men away from the vulnerable human it had chosen to protect. "Could be worth a bounty," the third man said, studying the wolf tracks with interest. "Pelt that size would fetch good money at the trading posts. Might make this whole trip worthwhile even if we don't find the Brennans." The scarred leader considered this, then shook his head. "We're here for debt collection, not hunting. The consortium doesn't pay us to chase wolves." He straightened up, scanning the surrounding forest. "Trail's gone cold anyway. Storm wiped out everything from the last 2 days. They could be anywhere by now. We should check the old trappers' cabins," one of the younger men suggested. "The Brennan family would need shelter, and there are 3 abandoned structures within 5 miles of here. Good thinking. Let's move out." The voices began to fade as the men continued their search elsewhere, but the wolf remained tense and alert for several minutes after they disappeared. Only when the forest had returned to complete silence did the animal finally relax, though its eyes continued to scan their surroundings with vigilant intensity. Elias found himself staring at the creature beside him with a new understanding. The wolf had somehow recognized the threat these men posed, had understood that they meant harm, not just to predators in general, but specifically to the boy under its protection. The animal had weighed the risks and chosen patience over aggression, understanding that an attack would draw attention while stillness meant safety. What kind of creature showed such intelligence? Such loyalty to a complete stranger? And most importantly, what had taught it to understand the dark intentions of men? The wolf waited until the morning sun had climbed higher before indicating they should move. It nudged Elias gently but insistently, then walked several steps away before looking back with expectant golden eyes. The message was clear. They needed to leave this exposed location and find somewhere more secure. Elias struggled to his feet, using the pine tree for support. His injured leg had stiffened during the cold night, and every movement sent sharp pains shooting up his thigh. But he gritted his teeth and forced himself to take one step, then another, while the wolf watched patiently. Once again, the animal moved to his weaker side, offering its strong back as a living crutch. Together, they began a slow journey deeper into the forest, following game trails that wound between massive trees and around snow-covered boulders. The wolf seemed to know exactly where it was going, choosing paths that provided cover while remaining passable for someone with Elias's limitations. They traveled for nearly 2 hours, stopping frequently to rest Elias's aching leg. During these breaks, the wolf would range ahead briefly, scouting their route and ensuring they weren't being followed. Then it would return, pressing close to share its warmth while the boy caught his breath. The forest grew denser as they climbed higher into the mountains. The pine trees here were ancient giants, their trunks so thick that 3 men couldn't have linked arms around them. The snow was deeper too, making travel even more difficult, but the wolf seemed to understand the terrain intimately. It led Elias along ridgelines where the wind had scoured away much of the snow, making the walking easier despite the exposed positions. Finally, they emerged into a clearing dominated by a weathered log cabin. The structure looked old but solid, its walls built from massive logs that had been expertly notched and fitted together. The roof was covered with thick bark tiles, and a stone chimney rose from one end. Moss grew on the north-facing wall, and the windows were shuttered against the weather. But there was something about the place that suggested it was maintained rather than truly abandoned. The wolf approached the cabin cautiously, circling the perimeter and testing the air with its keen senses before determining it was safe. Only then did it lead Elias to the front door, which hung slightly ajar as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly well maintained. The main room contained a rough-hewn table and chairs, a sleeping platform built against one wall, and a large stone fireplace that still held cold ashes from a recent fire. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with a faint medicinal scent. A stack of firewood sat beside the hearth, and Elias could see supplies stored on crude shelves, sacks that might contain grain or dried beans, jars of preserved foods, basic tools and equipment. The wolf explored every corner of the cabin with methodical thoroughness, its behavior more like a cautious homeowner than a wild animal entering strange territory. When it reached the area near the fireplace, it stopped and began to whine softly, pawing at something beneath a loose floorboard. Elias watched in fascination as the animal managed to work the board free, revealing a cache hidden beneath. Inside were supplies that someone had clearly prepared for emergency use. More dried meat wrapped in oiled cloth, a leather pouch containing metal tools and fire-starting materials, a thick bearskin blanket that would provide far better insulation than the thin wool covering Elias had been left with, and, most importantly, a hand-carved crutch made from seasoned ash wood. Elias lifted the crutch with trembling hands, and his breath caught in his throat. It was sized perfectly for someone of his height and build, with the crosspiece positioned at exactly the right height for his armpit. The wood had been sanded smooth and oiled to prevent splinters, and the base was wrapped with leather strips to provide traction on slippery surfaces. Someone had made this specifically for a disabled 14-year-old boy. Someone had known he would need it. The wolf sat back on its haunches and watched as Elias tested the crutch's strength, supporting his weight more effectively than anything he'd used since the accident that had damaged his leg. The animal's golden eyes held what could only be described as satisfaction, as if it had successfully completed an important task. "Who made this?" Elias asked aloud, though he didn't expect an answer. "Who knew I would be here?" The wolf moved to the window and took up a watchful position, its eyes scanning the forest beyond. But Elias could no longer focus on immediate dangers. A more pressing question consumed his thoughts. Someone had planned for this moment, had prepared this sanctuary, knowing that a disabled boy might need refuge in the wilderness. But who? And how long had they been watching his family? With the crutch supporting his weight, Elias explored the cabin more thoroughly while the wolf maintained its vigil at the window. In a wooden chest near the sleeping platform, he discovered additional supplies, several changes of clothes in various sizes, more blankets, a collection of hand-drawn maps showing the surrounding territory, and a leather-bound journal filled with neat handwriting. Elias opened the journal carefully, his fingers stiff from the cold. The first entry was dated 3 months earlier, September 14th. The Brennan family passed through today. Traded for supplies at the settlement. The boy, Elias, has a severe limp from an old injury. Watched the mother's face when she looked at him. Seen that expression before? She's already calculating what it would cost to leave him behind. The entries continued. Chronicling his family's movements with disturbing accuracy. September 28th. Debt collectors from the Northern Consortium asking questions about the Brennans. They're 2 weeks behind, but closing the gap. The family knows they're being followed. Moving faster now, taking fewer rest days. October 3rd, prepared the mountain cabin today. Stocked it with supplies for a boy of approximately 14 years. Made a crutch using measurements I estimated from watching him walk. Also gathered medicines for treating exposure and frostbite. Luna understands what we're preparing for. She's been restless, as if she senses the coming need. Luna. So that was the wolf's name. Elias flipped through more pages, reading account after account of someone watching his family from a distance, predicting their route, preparing for the moment when they would abandon him. The detail was extraordinary. This unknown watcher knew not just where they were going, but what they were thinking, what choices they would make when desperation set in. The final entry made his hands shake. October 15th, storm coming. Big one. This is when it will happen. I've shown Luna the boy's scent. Let her follow at a distance. When they abandon him, she'll be there. Everything is ready. I only hope I'm not too late this time. This time. What did that mean? A sound outside drew Elias's attention. Through the window, he could see a figure approaching through the trees, a man moving with the confident stride of someone who knew these woods intimately. He was older, perhaps 60, with a long gray beard and weathered features that spoke of decades spent in harsh conditions. He carried a pack laden with supplies and what appeared to be fresh game. Luna's reaction was immediate and revealing. Instead of growling or showing any sign of aggression, the wolf simply moved away from the window and settled near the cold fireplace, as comfortable as if this were a daily routine. The man knocked twice on the cabin door, then entered without waiting for a response. His pale gray eyes found Elias immediately, and a slight smile creased his weathered features. "Good," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Elias couldn't quite place. "You found the supplies. I wasn't certain Luna would get you here in time." "You knew," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You knew they would leave me." The old man nodded grimly as he set down his pack and began unloading provisions. Fresh venison, root vegetables, additional blankets, and other necessities. "Your father came through the settlement 6 weeks ago," he said. "Desperate man. Owing money to dangerous people. I saw how he looked at you, saw the calculations in his eyes. I've seen that look before." He moved to the fireplace and began building up a fire with practiced efficiency. "My name is Thomas Vance. I've been living in these mountains for 30 years, watching families pass through, watching some of them make terrible choices. Why would you help me?" Elias asked. "You don't even know me." Thomas struck flint to tinder, coaxing flames to life in the stone hearth. "Because 40 years ago my own family left me to die in mountains much like these. Different reasons, same result. I was 16 and I had consumption. They thought I was dying anyway, so they saved themselves the burden of watching it happen." He hung a pot over the growing fire and began adding chunks of meat and vegetables. "I survived, obviously. Found help from an old trapper who took me in, taught me to live in the wilderness. By the time I recovered enough to return to civilization, my family had moved on. I never saw them again." Luna rose from her position near the fire and padded over to Thomas, who scratched behind her ears affectionately. "Luna here lost her own pups last spring. Bear attack! She's been searching for something to protect ever since. When I showed her your scent, let her understand what we were preparing for. She knew exactly what to do. Animals understand loss differently than we do, but they understand it deeply." Elias stared at the wolf with new appreciation. "You trained her to find me?" "Not trained, guided. I showed her where your family was going, let her follow at a safe distance. When they abandoned you, she was already there, already watching. The rest was her choice. She decided you were worth saving. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed raised new questions. The debt collectors are still looking for my family. If they find me here, they'll torture me for information about where my parents went." Thomas stirred the pot thoughtfully. "I know. They passed through yesterday, asking questions at the settlement. Which is why we need to make them believe they've already found what they're looking for." Over the next hour, as the stew simmered and the cabin grew warm, Thomas explained his plan. It was risky, dependent on split-second timing and the debt collector's greed, but it might be their only chance to send the hunters in the wrong direction. The consortium men are predictable, Thomas said, spreading one of his hand-drawn maps on the table. They're good at tracking, but they're even better at following money. If they think there's profit to be made, they'll pursue it even if it means abandoning their original mission temporarily. He pointed to various locations on the map. There are 3 abandoned trapping cabins in this area. They'll check each one systematically. This cabin is the most remote, which means they'll save it for last. That gives us maybe 8 hours to prepare. Prepare for what? Elias asked. To convince them that you're not worth their time, and to point them towards something that is. Thomas pulled several items from his pack, bottles of herbal tinctures, animal blood carefully preserved in sealed containers, and lengths of rope. We're going to stage a scene. Make them think you've been here for weeks, barely alive, driven half mad by exposure and starvation. Make them think you're so far gone that you can't possibly provide useful information. Elias understood the logic, but something troubled him. What about my family? If the collectors give up looking for them, won't that be better? Thomas's expression grew serious. Your family abandoned you to die, Elias. They made their choice. Now you need to make yours. Do you want to protect people who left you in a blizzard to freeze, or do you want to survive? The question hung in the air between them. Elias thought about his mother's cold expression as they lifted him from the wagon, his father's refusal to meet his eyes, his sister's deliberate distance. They had chosen their own survival over his. Why should he sacrifice himself to protect them? What do I need to do? He asked finally. Thomas nodded approvingly and began explaining the details. They would make it appear that Elias had been living as a wild creature, scavenging for food, losing his grip on sanity. The herbal tinctures would induce a temporary fever that would make him appear genuinely ill. The ropes would show that Thomas had initially tried to restrain him, thinking he was a threat. The blood would suggest injuries from exposure and animal attacks. When they arrive, you'll be barely conscious, Thomas instructed. Delirious. You'll mumble about cold and hunger and being alone for so long. If they ask about your family, you'll seem confused, unable to remember clearly. Days will blend together in your mind. Directions will make no sense. They spent the afternoon preparing. Thomas applied the tinctures to Elias's skin, creating the appearance of fever and exposure. He used animal blood to stain the boy's clothes and bandages, making it look like he'd suffered multiple injuries. He positioned Elias on the sleeping platform in a way that suggested long-term illness, surrounded by evidence of failed attempts at self-care. Luna seemed to understand what was happening. She stayed close to Elias throughout the preparations, offering comfort and warmth. Thomas explained that she would need to be outside when the collectors arrived, to avoid drawing attention to the wolf's unusual behavior. Luna is worth at least 200 in silver for her pelt, Thomas said quietly. If the collectors see her here, tame and protective, they'll realize something isn't right. She needs to appear wild, dangerous, just another threat in a wilderness full of them. As the sun began to set, Thomas positioned himself near the window to watch for approaching visitors. He'd left clear tracks leading to the cabin, knowing the collectors would eventually find them. Now it was just a matter of waiting. Elias lay on the sleeping platform, feeling the fever tinctures beginning to work. His skin grew hot and flushed, and a genuine confusion started to cloud his thoughts. Thomas had warned him this would happen. The herbs induced real symptoms that couldn't be faked, making the deception more convincing. They're coming, Thomas said quietly, his eyes fixed on movement in the forest. 3 of them moving cautiously. Luna, it's time. The wolf moved to the door, looking back at Elias one final time before slipping outside and disappearing into the darkening forest. Even in his fever-addled state, Elias felt a pang of loss at her absence. In just 2 days, the animal had become more family than his blood relatives had ever been. Heavy footsteps approached the cabin, accompanied by the low murmur of voices discussing strategy. Elias closed his eyes and let the fever pull him deeper into delirium. Trusting Thomas to handle what came next, the door crashed open with sudden violence, and 3 hard-faced men burst into the cabin with weapons drawn. The leader was the same scarred man Elias had seen that morning, tall, lean, with the cold eyes of someone who had done terrible things for money and would do them again without hesitation. Well? the man said, his gaze sweeping across the cabin's interior before settling on Elias's fever-racked form. Looks like we found something interesting after all. Thomas stood near the fireplace, his rifle leaning casually against the wall, but within easy reach. That boy crawled in here 3 days ago, half dead from exposure. Been trying to nurse him back to health, but he's not making much progress. The leader approached the sleeping platform slowly, studying Elias with calculating eyes. This is Elias Brennan. We have descriptions. The family we're looking for abandoned a disabled son somewhere in these mountains. He leaned closer, examining the blood-stained bandages and fevered skin. You just happened to find him? I find lots of things in these woods, Thomas replied evenly. Dead animals, lost equipment, occasionally people who've made poor decisions. This boy was more dead than alive when I came across him. Figured I'd try to save him, see if he had any useful information. And does he? The question was sharp, demanding. Thomas shrugged. Sometimes he makes sense, mostly he doesn't. Fever's got him pretty bad. When he does talk, it's mostly about being cold and hungry. Can't get a coherent story about where his family went. One of the younger collectors moved to the sleeping platform and snapped his fingers near Elias's ear. Boy, can you hear me? We need information about your family. Where did they go? Elias let his head loll to one side, eyes unfocused. The fever was real now, making it easy to appear delirious. He mumbled incoherently, mixing fragments of real words with meaningless sounds. Cold. So cold. They left. Everyone leaves. The snow swallows everything. Useless, the young collector growled, straightening up. Kid's brain is cooked. But the leader wasn't convinced. His eyes were sharp and suspicious as he studied both Elias and Thomas, clearly sensing that something about this situation didn't quite add up. Funny thing, he said slowly, moving around the cabin and examining the supplies. For a boy who's been barely alive for 3 days, this cabin seems awfully well stocked. Fresh firewood. Recent cooking. This isn't just a sick boy stumbling into an abandoned shelter. Thomas's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his rifle. I live here half the year. Of course it's well stocked, do you know? The leader picked up the journal from the table, flipping through its pages. Interesting reading. Very detailed observations about families passing through these mountains, almost like you've been watching them, planning something. The tension in the cabin stretched tight as a bowstring. Elias, through his fever haze, could see the situation deteriorating rapidly. The collector was too smart, too observant. He was going to see through their deception, and then a massive shape appeared silently in the doorway behind the 3 intruders. Luna had returned, her timing perfect. The wolf's golden eyes fixed on the leader with deadly intent, and a low growl rumbled from deep in her chest, a sound that promised violence if these strangers didn't leave immediately. Nobody move, Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority. Luna doesn't like strangers in her territory. That boy's injuries. Half of them came from her claws when he first arrived. She'll do worse to you if you give her reason. The 3 collectors froze, suddenly aware of the massive predator blocking their only exit. Luna took a single step forward, her impressive size filling the doorway completely. In the confined space of the cabin, she looked enormous, her thick winter coat bristling with aggression. Easy now, the leader said, his earlier confidence evaporating. We're just looking for information. No need for anyone to get hurt. Information costs, Thomas replied, settling into his role. Especially when it comes from someone I've been nursing back to health. The boy's told me some things during his lucid moments. Question is, what's that worth to you? The collectors exchanged glances trapped between Thomas's rifle and Luna's fangs. They were professional hunters of debt, but wolves were outside their expertise. And this wolf was clearly not intimidated by human presence. 100 in silver, the leader offered, his eyes never leaving Luna's massive form. For everything the boy told you about his family's route? 300, Thomas countered. And you leave peacefully. No questions about how I conduct my business out here. No mention of the wolf or the boy to anyone at the settlements. The leader's jaw tightened, but he was in no position to negotiate. Done, but the information better be accurate. Thomas lowered his rifle slightly, a gesture of conditional trust. The boy rambled about his family heading west toward the Morrison Pass. They're planning to cross into the western territories before the heavy snows hit, probably trading their wagon for supplies at Fort Davidson. That's about 60 miles from here, rough terrain, but passable if you move fast. It was a complete fabrication. sending the collectors in the opposite direction from where the Brennan family had actually gone. But it was detailed enough, specific enough to seem legitimate.